G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day. So far a fantastic week, you're keeping busy and you're keeping yourself out of trouble. Now as always we have a lot to go over. Of course we're going to look at the maps, we're going to look at a very important area where Ukraine has had a successful offensive and so has Russia, but in different spots. And we'll talk about how this is going to affect of course the large area of Velika Novosilka as well. So we'll look over the maps and I've got a lot of geolocations to show you as well. At time of recording, Deep State map just updated, so we're going to be going through it together. I want to talk about ATACMS, I want to talk about fiber optic controlled drones, and we're just building the picture on what these look like, the cost of them, and how effective they are or are not. We need to talk about future negotiations. Now, of course, the US is saying that Ukraine and Russia, it's up to Ukraine to put the start on where they negotiate and that they have to be happy with the plan. But at the end of the day, the US can absolutely influence this absolutely massively, because if the US were to pull support, well, it's going to go downhill much faster. And at the same time, could the US put in more support if Putin and Russia want to continue the war? So we'll talk about that and something in this around this idea of something has to break first, and people are going, it's either the Russian economy will collapse or the Ukrainian front line collapse. I think many people are thinking that at this point in time. Now last night I did an interview with a doctor. Now he is a professional. The reason he's a doctor is due to the economy, and he focuses purely on the Russian and Eastern European Eurasia economy. So we're going to break down, is that actually a real thing that could occur? Could the Russian economy collapse? We'll speak about that. And I want to speak about Manpower and what the Washington Post has said. But some of you may be aware, I had an appointment with my neurosurgeon yesterday. I see the oncologist this coming Monday. Now, since the scans, it's only been a few weeks, but there's no significant shifts. And what they've had to do up top is healing up well. Now, there's no huge shift in the tumour. It's been too close. It's only been a couple of weeks. But some of the genetic markers that are coming back at the moment, they have shown that I may be eligible for a clinical trial. So hopefully, but I'm not putting all my chips on some future technology. I'm not the European Union and bloody Green New Deals and energy. But the surgeon will endeavour to get me onto this, but it is looking like Monday coming could be when I start chemotherapy. But I want to talk about long-range strikes and ATACMS. Now, it is interesting that as quickly as we saw the ATACMS and the Storm Shadow strikes into Russian territory come, we've seen them leave just as quickly. And I don't believe that this is purely due to Oreshnik. I actually believe that Oreshnik is a very small factor in that, as I do believe we will continue to see ATACMS and Storm Shadow strikes. But why are we seeing so little of them? And we've seen those strikes even after Oreshnik was dropped. So I believe that is a tiny factor, if at all. The main factor in this, I believe, is the availability of the systems. There's just not enough to give to Ukraine, or Ukraine's not receiving enough of them. And even if Ukraine have them, the policy that it has to go through to use that system, maybe they're not finding the places to hit these. And why this is strategically important is we saw those dropped. So we've seen these used. We know Ukraine has permission to fire these within Russian territory. And then it's been days or weeks between strikes. Russia will simply just move some of these items or reinforce important sectors in this delay. If Ukrainian attacks like this are going to be successful, they have to be simultaneous and they have to be successive. It can't be 1 or 2 bombs here, 2 weeks of nothing, and able to move things or build the counters to that. It has to be simultaneous and successive. That's how attacks have to be. And in this, if you actually read the doctrine around simultaneous and successive attacks, even if an attack fails, you have to continue on other sectors. Again, the S and the S, simultaneous and successive. So let's look at the ATACMS. And this was a part just brought out of a Washington Post article. We'll look over the rest of it later. But the Pentagon is closely monitoring Kursk for indications of how the fight is affected by the Biden administration's recent decision to stop to drop a long-standing prohibition of firing US-made missiles. The ATACMS has a range of 190 miles. Ukrainian forces have conducted strikes inside Russia, employing the Storm Shadow as well. So far, the official said those missiles had only a disruptive effect on the overall fight, showing slowing the integration of North Korean forces. Again, the longer this goes on, the North Korean forces, it's becoming a little bit like the Ghost of Kiev or the 30 HIMARS systems that Russia has blown up. It seems to be more of an informational warrior. There are those debris hitting HIMARS and taking out more than were ever donated to Ukraine, or the Ghost here, it seems to be more in the informational sphere than realistic. To me, anyway, there's still no evidence of these North Korean soldiers turning up to fight. The evidence of training in Russia, yes, but that is significantly different. Like I've said, there's far more benefit to Ukraine so far of these North Koreans, because they've got signed off to use long-range strikes, than actual capability to the Russian forces. The Kremlin has vowed consequences for Kyiv's Western backers and recently fired a powerful new missile into Ukraine, the Oreshnik. This is a modified nuclear doctrine as well. We've spoken about it. Basically signing off conventional attacks into Russia can be seen as an attack by a nuclear power if they are supporting that, and of course then can return in nuclear ways. We're not going to see this for the amount of strikes we have seen. Again, this has only had a disruptive effect, and that's probably putting it highly on the entire front line. The fight in Kursk, potentially. The Biden administration officials, they've downplayed the risk of further escalation with Russia, saying they continue to believe it is in neither side's interest to gamble with direct war between two nuclear powers. Can you see the irony in this, though? That the gamble, too, is one way and the other. It's not just all one. You're talking about gamble, direct war between nuclear powers. Well, you're giving these strikes. Russia's, yes, they are threatening back, but the strike, there is a lot of irony, I think, in that statement. Will we see more of these strikes? I'm sure that we will. Will they have effect? I'm sure that they will. But the longer this is between strikes, the less effective they are going to be. Now, let's have a look on the map. So here is Ukraine in the centre, the capital of Kyiv. The red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014, the red check on this map. Of course, ground made by the Russians in the past 24 hours. The blue within Ukraine's borders, forget about Kursk for now, but the blue within Ukraine's borders, ground that Ukraine has made in the last 2 weeks, which can make it a bit difficult to see daily gains by the Ukrainian forces, because we can accidentally see this in 10 days and say there's an advancement here. But we need to come down into Velika Novosilka. Now we can see a large amount of red and an amount of blue on this map as well. Now this blue, this is incredibly important. I'd spoken about more and more. There are 2 main roads running through here. Russia had cut off both of these, not strategically. I know I've stuffed it up. Not strategically, but physically cut that off. I have said, expect to see a Ukrainian counter-attack into here to try and open up that road again. Now, luckily for the Ukrainians, we have seen that occur, and it has shown to be, at least by these maps and the footage, it has shown that it is successful. Now, I have then this Ukrainian flag being flown here. Deep State map has shown this amount of footage. One thing I will say is this flag, it still is being flown under cover here as well. If you take that as anything, potentially there's still a lot of active fighting going on in the area. Again, some of these frontline areas can be so fluid, even just night to day, so we will see what occurs here, because Russia will want to cut off those supply routes. But of course, this flag, if you look on the geolocation, was right in the centre around Novye Komar as well, at least where the Russians had held close enough to that area. So we are saying that there has been that pushback in there, hopefully for the Ukrainians, freeing up that road. Now, we come down the south and we can see a lot of ground has been made here. That if we go from this point to the end point here, 3.75 kilometres, that is a long way. We go from here to, well, there to there, you're talking 5 kilometres. That is a lot of ground in one day. Now, this map has just updated, so we're surprised to see this as well. What I had prior to this was we see this Russian flag being flown here. Again, see how this is up over the top of something? It may indicate more control, grey may, but then we have a look, and this is in Blahatne down in here. So we see where this road, it's right on the corner in here, much further into that territory than this map is shown. We're just going to come just to the west of here a little bit, and we see this Novodarivka. They're saying that the Russian military has taken full control over Novodarivka in this sector right here, still being shown as a bit of green. But this area is very, very important to look at and not forget, even if you can be distracted by Kurakhove and Pokrovsk. This can all cause a lot of issues very quickly. But let's talk about Pokrovsk and maybe just move away. We'll come back down south here in a little bit. But of course, we've got Pokrovsk, Minograd. Now, I believe the Russian forces, everyone believes the Russian forces, of course, want to take Pokrovsk. It makes both strategic and tactical sense. But it will be very difficult because large city, large urban fighting. That said, we have seen large urban centres recently, Seledov, Kurakhivka, some of Kurakhove, fall with a lot less resistance than we had presumed. So we will see. But it is in my belief that Russia at the moment is softening up Pokrovsk for further assaults. Now, I've said it seems that it's paint by numbers at the moment. And it seems that the Russian has this like paint by number tactic and it continues working. Okay, so they put soldiers, armour, and just mass on the flanks of an area. Okay, the flanks are being developed, as you can see by Zvolte. They hit the area with FABs initially to soften that up. Then they launched TOS thermobaric heavy flamethrower, and then they have recon elements before trying to have some level of break-in, but securing the flanks so there is a withdrawal, so the break-in is easier. Now, of course, we've seen a lot of FABs and a lot of Krasnopol and Iskander working in this area, but this is claimed by a Russian page, so take this, please, with a grain of salt. But we can see they're claiming that, and you can see the page that's shared at the BTR-80, they're claiming that this is TOS-1 working inside Pokrovsk. Now, I tried to find a geolocation on this. I cannot, but if that is only, if it is or not, that is only one element to it. If it's not, I apologise, but I'm putting out there that I may not be, but I've seen many pages sharing it saying that's what it is. Furthermore, in this softening up, is Russia is trying to prevent Ukraine from digging in fortified defensive positions. My opinion, this is an area which has been on the front line for some time. That should be well developed by this point. Now, we've seen a lot of footage come out through Russian pages today, and I've got some geolocations to show you. So, in Pokrovsk, and I'll show you the geolocation in 1 second, we can see multiple Russian drones here working, and what you can see is this is a flatbed truck with an excavator on the back of it. Now, people are claiming this is 3. No, it's not. The first drone hits, the truck has then stopped, and then the other drones hit the truck. You can see where the oil is out on the ground, but by the end have destroyed that excavator. This is on the road running out of Pokrovsk. In the same day, we see this. So just to the south of here, we see a Russian drone here, the Ukrainian excavator digging in positions and targeting and destroying that excavator there. Now, I've put both of these on this is the first one, it's heading out that road, and then the second one, apologies, is down here. So if we have a look, what we're looking for is this Zorove, so right on like this corner here, and the other one is just up here. So only a few kilometers apart, but I believe Russia is trying to prevent Ukraine from having those fortified positions dug in, or new ones being dug in, and if that footage is as we see it, as to be believed, softening it up with things like TOS-1. We know the first elements of trying to get the flanks is developing. It's definitely not there, but it's developing, and those FABs, of course, they have been dropping for a while, as well as laser-guided things like Krasnopol. Now, what we see here is we do see some fair updates on this map today. Now, it isn't too different, but it's a lot of like where the grey zone sits. So see where this road turns up to the north? This is this road. So it's just saying that all of this is then taken under control. You can see the areas of where they're saying there are further gains, as well to the south of Pushkeni as well, where there is at least some movement. So we can assume there was definitely some movement around that Zoroya front as well. So Pokrovsk is developing. It is developing quickly as a whole. Yeah, this area onto Pokrovsk may not be, but there's a lot of other areas down to the south of here that I believe Russia would need to take first before further break-ins, and to soften up, collapse some areas, and then it may be game on for Pokrovsk, but I believe probably after Velika Novosilka. Again, we will see. So we come down to Kurakhove, Stary we can see Russia has expanded control around Stary Will we see a further wrap around here and be able to come and cut off this supply route running through Dashne? Potentially, we're not sure. Of course, the dam is down in this location. Again, wait and see, but it is putting more risk on the flanks. Down in this salient, we can see Sukhayali, some ground made by the Russians, as well down in Ilininkia front too, that this area is moving slowly but surely, grinding forwards, and it's no different today. We look on this map, Syriac's map, and shows in 3 of the same axes. That is where Russia is going. Eventually, at some point, these maps are going to line up 100%, no matter where the border sits. At some point, it is definitely going to. So let's move up. Nothing around Toretsk that I can see, just in Bakhmut. Now, what we do see is Chasiv Yar. Now, the reason I have this geolocation for you today is this was before the map updated. So right in the center here, still right on the outskirts there, what we can see are positional battles between Russian and Ukrainian forces, and that this is filmed off a Ukrainian drone. It's not super clear what is being said, what is being shown in that footage, but we can see there definitely was a Russian advancement into this center of Chasiv Yar. Then we look, Syriac map, and he's showing quite similar, but more of a break-in into these like warehouses here, which is more so of what that footage is showing us. Let's continue moving to the north. Now, we saw this, of course, over the past then day. We saw Ukraine has pushed back the Russian bridgehead that was formed across the Oskil. That has been pushed back, and Syriac is saying the same thing. Of course, there was 2 that opened. The southern one is still open. The northern one is being pushed back. Ukrainian army eliminated the north bridgehead created by the Russian army last week, and they've secured that area. That is very important because you don't want large amounts getting across that Oskil River, that this is working as a natural border both ways. It's very hard for Russia to attack this way, but it's also very hard for Ukraine to attack back the other way. Now, let's move our way into Kursk, and this is something that I've wanted to talk about, of potential withdrawals out of here. Now, this was the end of an article, but in Kursk, some 60,000 Russian troops are tasked with expelling the Ukrainians and establishing a new buffer zone, more than 20 miles inside Ukraine's sovereign territory. So they're saying that Russian troops here are tasked with creating a new buffer zone. Okay, the official said, if we pull back, an army of 60,000 will follow us into our territory. And this is what you and I have been rubbing our crystal ball, or just looking at the maps without rose-coloured glasses on, have said could be a real reality into here. That Kursk pushed in, the Ukrainian forces pushed into Kursk, and then Russia was in a frenzy out here for a couple of weeks. Ukraine was able to get a lot of territory, at one point around 1,000 square kilometres. Now, after the months, 4 months, I believe, Russia is able to redeploy or deploy a lot of forces into here, including a lot of VDV, up to, they're claiming, 60,000. Now, at this point in time, all troops are held up fighting each other. The Ukrainians are fighting the Russians are fighting the Ukrainians, so there's nowhere else to push, because if you take troops away, it's going to go, Ukraine will go further or Russia will come further. The problem becomes is if Ukraine goes, we need these guys, we need them on an area of the front line that is collapsing, like Pokrovsk, like Velika Novosilka, like Berestov areas, that if they now withdraw out of here, as that official said, why then would these 60,000 not deploy straight across? They've got the vehicles there, they've got the men there, they've got the logistics there, if that is to be true. And that is a real threat of something that could occur. Now, I want to talk about fibre optics. So, firstly, I got sent across this, thank you very much, for a 10-kilometre built-in air unit for an FPV drone on AliExpress or Alibaba. You're talking about 1,000 Australian dollars. Well, there's a discount on this, maybe I'm lucky, but you're talking about that much. That's about 600-ish USD. And they do talk about here as well for underwater robot use. So the cable in this is specific underwater cable as well. That's going to make more sense when we have a look at this. The fact it's a fibre optic cable without a repeater can be tens or even upwards of 100 kilometres that these can reach. But every 70 k's in underwater, they have a repeater due to a lot of losses that can occur through fibre optic cables, such as then the bending loss or just signal loss, referred to here as lossier cables. Underwater fibre optics have a lot of coating, so Russia may or may not be using these due to that. And of course, that brings in weight too. That Russia doesn't need massive amounts of data share, they just need a smooth and visible amount of data, so different cables can be used. But we talk about this as well. This the first two factors reduce the maximum range, but the third one increases the maximum range because you can use a much thinner cable, you're not transferring as much data. But after that 10 kilometers, the attenuation that limits the max range, it wouldn't be this. What it is the gradual loss of signal strength through having a longer cable, as we've seen through bending losses or through scattering, absorption and imperfections in the cable, which can weaken that signal. Therefore, it's not as reliable. Now, China, I would say, as he says, makes millions of kilometres of this, and so does Russia to a much smaller degree, as he says. I would expect Russia to use them to detect and disable the electronic warfare equipment. Even if the equipment itself is hardened like a tank, the antenna, they have to stick out. Once they're disabled, Lancets can finish off the armour, or once the electronic warfare equipment is silent, FPV drones can operate. So these will go in first, take out those bits of equipment that will be having an effect on your radio-controlled cheaper items, and then bring it to the fold. What he also talks about in that is there are numbers being thrown around $17,000 per system, and he says, look, it's going to be more expensive than a typical radio-controlled drone, but it's not going to be that much. The extra part is about $1,000. You buy it in mass, you probably get a lot cheaper, and even then, it's not going to climb up into that amount of cost. Now, there's always been questions around the range, and this is a very handy video. This is on a Russian FPV drone carrying an RPG, and just over this time lapse here, you can see not only the distance in which this is traveling, but you can see an FPV drone going over a lot of things on the ground. It's going over houses, it's going over power lines, it's going over trenches, over trees, everything. So that cable is, that physical umbilical is more resistant than we may have thought in the beginning. And I asked you, has anyone seen Ukraine operating fibre optically controlled drones? Because we've seen Russia roll that out over the past weeks massively up and in the front line. And this is a Ukrainian Banshee drone testing with a fibre optic spool underneath it here. Of course, a much larger drone, maybe to carry other drones or maybe to drop other systems as well. What we have spoken about is maybe not at this point in time, but future down the line, we may see an umbilical connected drone, then with its own umbilicals working off that, and you can increase range, acting as a repeater, as we see the IDF doing with radio-controlled drones, repeating to drones operating in tight spaces. We could see that with a much more reliable, much stronger physical connection. Of course, the IDF is not going to need it where they're using them due to the lack of electronic warfare assets, but maybe Russia or Ukraine or the West or China will have something like this come into play. Now let's talk about, did I want to talk about the manpower first? Let's talk about manpower first, and then we'll talk about the negotiation, and we'll talk about $50 billion. Sullivan said that between now and Trump's inauguration, the administration will send Kyiv hundreds of thousands of artillery rounds and thousands of rockets. The president is seeking to put Ukraine in its strongest possible position, something we hear more and more and more. Biden's opportunity to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position begun before 22, but okay, let's say it begun through 22. There's not enough time in the 30-something days to go. There's not enough time at this point. If the war is to end when Trump gets in, there's not enough time to be put into a strong possible position at that point, seeing what we are seeing, other than something unbelievable being deployed, other than that we're given 50 Tridents. One senior administration official said that although Ukraine's firepower had waned with the slowdown of US military aid before Congress in April approved $61 billion, that's less of a problem now. The munitions gap may not be completely closed between Ukraine and Russia, but it's gotten a whole lot better. On the manpower side, it's just a question of maths and physics, speaking that the others on the condition of anonymity. So they're not willing to put their name behind this. But again, the manpower problem is a real problem, much more difficult to be fixed. It's more of a question of maths than physics. I am not trying to accuse Ukraine of anything. It's a very challenging issue for them. the official said. But over the course of especially this year, it's just that they are not mobilising and training enough soldiers to replace battlefield losses. Of course, Ukrainian officials go, but you're not giving us the amount of equipment we need to justify a mobilisation. This is where there is this head, butt, and pointing fingers. You know what that pointing fingers doesn't do? Doesn't help the front line. Senior administration officials have said that they don't expect a major breakdown of Ukraine's defensive lines in the coming months, even if Moscow continues to advance. As I have shown you over every day for the past 6 months, multiple defensive lines are falling day to day or week to week. A lot of defensive positions from Vuhledar through to Avdiivka, we need to take that into account. Now, areas around Velika Novosilka, around Maximivkia, around Pokrovsk, these are major defensive lines that are being threatened right now, particularly in the southeast. So they are under threat currently. It's not if they're expecting to come under threat, they are under threat right now. These officials cautioned, however, that the race to use the remainder of the $61 billion supplemental aid bill has the potential to strain the US military. There is a particular way about the volume of air defence, intercepting missiles, artillery shells, and things that they cannot replace quickly. We have said this. I said this when everything kicked off in Israel, especially with then the other country starting with an I in the same sector, which you can't say on YouTube because I've no idea, can't say a country, regardless of what you think of the state. But once they start firing things in, Israel's going to get allocated this air defence before Ukraine is, and that could make a massive shortage. And it seems like we are seeing this. Talk about other hotspots. The US readiness is at severe and serious risk if other needs aren't balanced against Ukraine. So at the end of the day, Ukraine is fighting a war locally. To them, it's existential. I understand all that. The US is the global military power. They need to look in many different fronts, and they can't jeopardise their security somewhere else. That is basically what they're saying. Long term, the gap between Russian and Ukrainian recruiting efforts probably will end up being far more important in determining the course of the war. Absolutely. Ukraine's exhausted military is being challenged by severely undermanned front lines, as well as slow-going mobilisation and training efforts. Zelensky lowered the draft age from 27 to 25 in April, and they have gone away with a sweep of exemptions. So if you've got a crook back or crook knee, you can still be sent. But if you are wealthy enough, that is the exemption no one will ever get around. Anyway, officials say there is spare capacity to help train an entire brigade of Ukrainian recruits outside the country if only Kyiv sent people their way. So they're saying here, they are saying, people in Biden's administration are saying, we could train an entire brigade if Kyiv sent these guys to us. That's not what we're hearing from Kyiv. From Kyiv, we're hearing that we've got people ready, but they're not armed to go. See where this is not lining up? The most decisive factor on the battlefield today is Ukrainian soldiers willing to fight to stabilise the front lines. Again, willing to fight. This is something that you just can't pull numbers, to quote the other official there, in maths and physics. It's not as simple as that. It's not as simple as one soldier here, one soldier there. No, what is the willingness to fight? There's a whole psychological aspect that comes into fighting a war like this. And the problem is the worse things get, the worse things get. The worse things become on the front line, these breakthroughs, this XYZ, less people will start recruiting. And of course, it happens the other way. So if Ukraine has more success, things will get better in recruiting both ways. Advisors to Donald Trump publicly and privately are floating proposals to end the war, end the Ukraine war that would cede large parts of the country to Russia for the foreseeable future. In my opinion, if the guns fall silent and Russia occupies any ground, that ground is going to not come back other than massive military intervention, which I believe no one wants for the next decade. The proposals by three key advisors, including Trump's incoming Russia-Ukraine envoy, of course, Lieutenant General Kellogg, share some elements, including taking NATO membership for Ukraine off the table. Of course, what we have seen Kyiv say is, if we will not settle for anything but NATO membership. And I agree with them. If I was in their position, I'd say, no. Anything but this is going to have the same fate that all this stuff did prior. That NATO is the only way forward. For that, I believe there needs to be large military victories in the front line. Trump's advisors would try forcing Moscow and Kyiv into negotiations with carrots and sticks, including halting military aid to Kyiv unless it agrees to talk, but boosting assistance if Russian President Vladimir Putin refuses. Now, I think the way the Kremlin may be assessing this, the way the senior officers may be assessing this, is like the articles we saw prior. Long-range strikes have had some effect. More shells and more interceptors and these have had some effect. But like we are hearing, manpower is the issue. And I believe if the Kremlin is assessing that manpower is primarily the factor that they are advancing, they may not be too concerned. If there is an increase in systems, it's going to be tougher, it's going to be more cost. But what in this is bringing Putin to the table? If manpower is the problem, well, and he had the advantage on the manpower, that is easier to overcome than just systems being delivered. Taken together, however, his advisor statements suggested potential contours of a Trump peace plan. So sort of pulling these people together and saying maybe this is what it will look like. We haven't actually seen his yet. Zelensky, facing manpower shortage and growing territorial losses, has indicated that he may be open to negotiations. This leads into what I believe the Kremlin's calculation would be is if that side hasn't spoken of any ceding of anything for years and now it has had this large shift, that would go into my calculation of how things must be looking. But he's still intent on NATO membership. Again, that is where he sees nothing other than this, which I do agree with, because anything else, even still, is still a signature on a piece of paper. But Trump may find Putin unwilling to engage. Analysts and former US officials said, as he has the Ukrainians in the back foot and may have more to gain by pursuing further land grabs, that Putin is in no hurry. And at what point, if you are having critical manpower shortages, at what point do we start seeing that real breakdown, that bankruptcy factor I talk about in attritional warfare? Little by little, then all at once. And this goes into where people believe Ukraine will have a victory and where Russia will have a victory. That the pro-Ukraine side is saying the Russian economy is, bit by bit and then will just fall off a cliff. And the Russian side is saying the Ukrainian military is moving back bit by bit and then will fall off a cliff. So who's going to be correct in that? Who is going to break first if there's not some level of negotiation? The Russian leader, he said, shows no readiness to drop his conditions for truce talks, including Ukraine abandoning its NATO quest and surrendering the 4 provinces Putin claims as part of Russia, but did not fully control, a demand rejected by Kyiv. Rumours said that Putin is likely to bide his time, take more ground, and wait and see if any concessions Trump may offer to lure him to the negotiating table. People aren't going to like it, but negotiations, like I've put into things here, negotiations are two-sided. To bring Putin to the table, there's going to have to be a big carrot, because I don't believe there's a big enough stick, because Putin can hide behind his own sticks. These sticks come in the form of 50 to 100 megatons. So it's going to be very, very difficult. And biding his time could just put Ukraine in a worse position. Therefore, why is he going to stop military actions? This is the question I'd like to ask one of these officials. Why do you believe Putin would stop military actions at this point in time? Reuters reported in May that Putin was ready to halt the war with a negotiated ceasefire that recognised current front lines, but was ready to fight Kyiv and the West if they did not respond. So back in May on that current front line was significantly less than where it is looking now. But of course, this was before the time of the Kursk offensive. We see this, the transition, the 3 main proposals, and we've seen what JD Vance has said about the freezing of the current front lines between these. And there's a bit of this between all 3 of these, but an increased in aid too, but NATO membership being put on hold. Ukraine would also be offered US security guarantees, which could include boosting weapons supplies after an accord is struck, according to that proposal. Sebastian Gorka, one of Trump's incoming Deputy National Security Advisor, said Trump had told him he would force Putin into talks by threatening unprecedented weapons shipments to Ukraine if Putin refused. Again, goes into what I've been saying before. It's going to have to be a hell of a stick, or a very large carrot. Gorka reached by phone, called Reuters fake news garbage and declined to elaborate. That makes me fucking happy. Gorka, come on the podcast. Sean Ryan, fantastic podcast if you don't watch it. A deal would likely, JD Vance, has told Sean Ryan, it would include demilitarisation of the existing front lines that would be heavily fortified to prevent further Russian incursions. His proposal would deny NATO membership to Kiev. Again, Ukraine's not going to go to that without NATO membership, and I think rightfully so. We've seen Grinnell, Trump's former ambassador to Germany, creation of autonomous zones. He suggested NATO membership for Ukraine was not in America's interest. So it's just bloody difficult of what this is actually going to look like. Is it going to be the current borders? I don't believe so. Putin would go, but I'm advancing on the borders. My economy's looking, well, we're going to talk about this on Monday, but if you take away just the idea of the ruble having a downward strength, the rest of the economy is looking like it's all right to pretty good. Again, it's going to be very difficult. Elements of proposals would likely face pushback from Zelensky, who has made NATO invitation part of his victory plan, and it is made it point number one on that nothing ends until that invitation comes through, whether it's victory plan, whether it's peace plan, whether it's whatever. That is like key point number one. Therefore, what is stopping further Russian actions? I don't think anybody has a realistic plan for ending this, and I agree. I don't think anyone has a realistic plan for ending the war in a way that doesn't look like a Russian victory and a Western loss, because that's what they're looking for at this point. We spoke about this. We spoke about that article from that Russian paper that was speaking about selling a victory, that Russia may have to have some information campaigns going, yes, we've lost a lot of guys, but look what we've walked away with. We've demilitarized Ukraine and denazification. Again, what I've said is those are very subjective. You can oh yeah, it's hard to measure. It's not a ruler. We're measuring kilometre squares of ground. It's like this. It's like a ruler. That's the problem, is I think Russia will have a far easier time selling a victory, regardless of the border. Even if the border ends and it just holds like Crimea, they can say, we demilitarise, denazify, because it's very hard to measure that. Where Ukraine has put nothing but 1991 borders and nothing but complete NATO membership. That is going to be a very hard sale if it is not this. There's no good plan in this. The plan the first plan should be to have never had this begin, to have the defensive alliances and the security guarantee strong enough that this never occurred, and we don't have now 500,000 to 2 million people bloody killed. Okay? But all the diplomats seemingly are useless. This is the biggest threat to the West, I think, is the incompetence in a lot of the leadership. Anyway, so the war has then begun, and now we're in a spot that no one knows how to get out of it. I'm not saying Putin knows how to get out of it either, but I'm talking on an aspect from the West, because what it's going to do is undermine the West massively. It could undermine economically, strategically, all of this, even down to the dollar, the euro, the pound, which is this. The G7 finalised 50 billion Ukraine loan backed by Russian assets profits. They reached a consensus on how to deliver loans of approximately $50 billion with the aim to start dispersing funds by the end of this year. So $50 billion, the profits made. That if you invest $5,000, your profits are minimal, even if you're in like some sort of broad market ETF sort of thing. 50 billion, well, your profit's going to be very fucking large. So those seized assets, the profit is going on to Ukraine. But people have said from day one, this can really undermine the security of the dollar, the euro, the pound, but significantly the dollar. The reason that the West has so much power is because we're allies with America, who's backed by the dollar. And what we have seen is, I believe, BRICS, especially with Russia and China at the helm, this de-dollarization is the biggest threat that would have huge effect. We've seen, obviously, the American incoming administration knows this as President-elect Donald Trump's threat about, we'll put 100% tariffs on if BRICS want to move away from the dollar. But what I ask in the interview is, will that backfire? Could it backfire? As now, if we adjust for the PPP, the purchase pairing parity, the GDP of BRICS is far larger than that G7, G13 also. So that is interesting. But does it reduce the trust in this? So we look at dispersed through the multiple channels to support Ukraine's budget, their military and reconstruction, and that Moscow should end the war and pay for damages caused to Ukraine. Of course, any country that moves into another one causes massive amounts of damage, historically has always then paid for the damages. The US would provide $20 billion in loans to Ukraine, paid back by the interest earned from the immobilized Russian sovereign aspects without burdening the taxpayer. Of course, the tyrants are responsible for the damages they cause. Again, history shows us that the aggressor always pays back for and rebuilds the country. So yeah, like the streets in Iraq, they're clean, they're looking great, it's awesome, and Russia's definitely going to pay back this. I wish it happened like that. The movies also committed the new US and Ukrainian tax dollars would not be the source of repayment. This is a bit blurry, okay? Because at the end of the day, if negotiations come through, so this money is going to Ukraine. So yep, this money allocated, and then the repayments on that, it's like buying a house. You buy a house, you borrow $200,000, bank, they're the ones that pay, and you pay them back the interest on that loan. This is similar to what is happening. So yes, in the beginning, you're saying without burdening the taxpayer, no. The money going initially is that, but it's being paid off those frozen Russian assets, the profits made. My concern here would be, what if in negotiations, which could come through in a couple of weeks, part of that negotiation is Russia go, we want all these frozen assets back under our control and we'll end blah, blah, blah. Could then the G7 be left with holding the bag? They've committed this money, the loan asset or the profit is now gone. Could you be left holding the bag? And I believe that is what Viktor Orban raised concerns of. But of course, you raise a concern like that, and the next thing, you're in a Tu-160 dropping bombs, if not more, of a criminal. Wider concern for movement away from the USD euro to freezing assets. Many have pointed at this as a problem of going, okay, people get the premise of freezing Russian assets, from super yachts to this to that. Again, is it freezing, in a lot of cases, a private asset? Yes, it is stealing that asset for an amount of time. Based on, in the G7, in NATO, the EU, have said that is the enemy, we're freezing those assets. The risk here is that you may have, say, for example, a Chinese billionaire who has a yacht, or a Chinese company that invests heavily somewhere going, well, I've got nothing to do with the government. If they launch this, or if they do something they're not going to be happy with, they could freeze all my shit. Right, maybe it is time to invest somewhere else, or support the de-dollarization of BRICS. So there is a real threat, and I believe this is the teeter that people are on. They don't want to undermine, we spoke about air defense missiles that could threaten US security, so they don't want to undermine their own security or economy by this, but they want to have Ukraine in a position of power and victory. This is down to my concept of the impossible diplomacy of Ukraine. It's very difficult, and I believe Putin knows this, and I believe he's playing on that. One of the dumbest things you can do is discredit people like Putin or Lavrov as poor statesmen, and not being very, what's the word I'm looking for, competent at moving their way through political negotiations like this. If you don't think they're talking about this sort of thing, of how can we make a sticking point somewhere, Russia has always been actually very good on that. You can look back at what leaders at the time even said about Stalin during World War II, let alone the horrible shit. The movement in a political setting can be very concerning, and can be very good also, and can be much more free in a much more authoritarian way, can make vertical command decisions rather than having to go back through Congress, or back to the Senate, or back through the House of Representatives, depending on the nation. So there is a concern there. And what I will say is Russia's hybrid warfare that we are seeing is, in my opinion, trying to create allies with countries that may not be friendly to the West. We obviously see that may also back further de-dollarization. And I believe Putin's biggest win would be if China could do something like this. And could Trump have pushed that along if he wants to add those tariffs? And China, particularly China, potentially India, to BRICS countries, call the bluff and go, add your tariff thing. Create their own currency, undermine the USD, could be a big, big issue. But there's more to speak on. Well, no, I could speak for an hour. Legends, I've had a lot going on today. Look after yourself. I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.